I was born in Jacksonville. I lived just off the river before it was developed. And in my childhood, I had a dog named Freckles, who was a Springer Spaniel, and we would go to the river constantly against my parents' um, demands. And I get in trouble all the time because it was St. John's is a pretty wide river, and it's got beautiful oaks on the side. It's got a beautiful wetland, and I would go down there and build, palmetto forts and swing on the vines. And it's actually my earliest memories of Florida. And one reason I am attracted to the Mayaca River is it's very much like the Mayaca River, except Mayaca is much smaller. And that kind of formulated my love for nature and for Florida. I've seen this town change a lot. The population in Sarasota really had not expanded too much up to about 1950. Slowly, it grew, and people realized this is a beautiful place and they want to be here. And but there never was any institutionalized protection. When I got here, when I was hired as a marine biologist, the first thing I did was I remember the first time I had a big project in Northport. A mobile home park wanted to dredge this really shallow creek where a lot of manatees swim up to Warm Mineral Springs to put a marina in. And I denied it and never, they go, what are you doing? You better be able to back this up. Well, I had a biologist working for me from New College, as a matter of fact, I just hired. And I trusted his analysis, and I trusted his ability to defend that denial. And it went through, and that was kind of the first time really we had said no to any kind of major environmentally harmful development project that I'm aware of. And then we started being tough about seawalls. We said, less seawalls, more revetments if we can get them with plants in them, something less harsh. It's little things like we had, stormwater is caught in these ponds next to the road. They're retention ponds or detention ponds. And the idea is that you hold the water until it runs off to the bay, sediment settles out, and you don't have a rush of nutrients and a rush of sediment into the bay, which is good. And so someone that worked for me said, why don't we create littoral zones in these ponds? Why don't we make them build them so that a third is shallow, and we'll plant emergent vegetation, wetland vegetation, which is, when you see birds in a wetland, they're not swimming around, they're walking in shallow water. And why don't we create that? Well, we did that. There wasn't too much pushback because, no one really cared if they had to build it a little differently. So we just started making some changes that focused on protecting some elements of, and protecting and enhancing, if we could, environmental quality. The development of Sarasota has evolved very rapidly in the last 8 years at almost a geometric pace. It's not even arithmetic anymore. It's just exploding. And I think that we have lost in Sarasota our, at least at the decision-making level, they've lost their focus on environmental protection. The 70s and the 80s were great decades. Late 70s, 80s, and 90s were great decades for environmental protection in Sarasota County. And again, and parts of the 2000s, early 2000s. And now it's being undone at a rate you can't believe. And subtly and quietly. It's done in ways that most people don't even see. And much of the environmental protection and laws and directives and initiatives are just being chewed up and eliminated. And that's unfortunate. Like anything else, it ebbs and flows. We had a strong period. Now it's ebbing, and we really need to really fight hard to maintain some of the things that have already been fought once, so we don't slip too far backwards. Ironically, the normal everyday guy will want to protect his resources. He'll want a nice environment. We tapped into that in 1999 when we passed a referendum for people to tax themselves to buy environmentally sensitive lands in the county. And we raised over $200 million, maybe $300 million in money and bonding, which is still going on, to buy lands, mostly along the Mayaca River, but also in other places. So Sarasota, this conservative Republican county, they taxed themselves to buy lands. It passed by 67%. We had to go back to the electorate 3 or 4 years later to increase the bonding capacity, because there was only 93 million the first time around, and we had bonding capacity way past that. And they voted for it again, and it passed over 70%. So 7 out of 10 people said, I will tax myself. I will pay for a program to save lands. So almost a third of Sarasota County is publicly owned and protected, which is huge in Florida. And we have bobcats, and we have panthers, and we have deer, and just about anything you can imagine, owls, hawks, that have a huge amount of land that'll support their populations. A pass is an opening between the bay and the Gulf. And some passes are dominated by waves, some by current. Like Big Pass is dominated, it's current driven. In other words, there's so much water going in and out, it scours it and it's going to stay open. A wave dominated pass is a storm comes in, there's waves, it'll fill it in quicker, it'll move. And I was the director of coastal zone management at the time when that whole issue came up. And Midnight Pass was what's called a dying pass. It was filling in, it was rapidly moving to the north. It wasn't very deep. When I first came here, it was very deep. You could go out to the end of the pass, catch big sharks, flow in and out. And Midnight Pass was filling in, and it was moving. When I say moving, the shoreline, the opening was gradually going north, and as it starts to get shallower and shallower, there's no velocity of water to scour it out. It becomes a sandbar. But unfortunately, as it was running north, there were 2 homes there. And unfortunately, one was a very famous artist. His name was Sid Solomon, a contemporary artist. And he had lots of friends and followers. So my advice was to let it go. It's going to close. These folks came before the commission and said, we need to close it on our own. And that involved putting in not many truckloads of sand in a very shallow area to close it down. And then there was a big stink because you closed the natural pass. Well, yeah, it was closed, but it was getting ready to close itself. But that doesn't matter. Man should never have gotten involved and tried to make that happen one way or the other. So they agreed to a plan to open it, which was totally designed to fail. It was just, I was there when they dug this ditch, and then when they opened it up to the Gulf of Mexico, and water went in and out between this 55 wide foot ditch that was, I don't know, maybe 20 feet deep. And then it was 2 a.m, and I went home. I lived up on the Key. I went home. I came back the next morning. It was closed up because the sand just filled in. I mean, the pass isn't just the opening between the island. It's the bar that's on one side of the island. It's the sandbar that's on the inside of the island and the bay. It's a system. So you can't just mess with one part and think you're going to be successful. So that connection to the Gulf closed. And it was, and people, I think, rightfully were mad because we interfered with the natural process. Unfortunately, and we had asked experts around the state, it was a pass that was rapidly becoming non-functional. It was going to eventually peter out. Unfortunately, there were 2 houses there. If those 2 houses weren't there, it would have the opening would have run north, and it would have, in one big storm, it probably would have silted in, and that would have been it. But that's not what happened. And that's what happens when you try to direct natural processes to get what you want. At some point, you've got to go back and do something else. You have to do something else, and you end up creating a mess.